Hello History Batch, I'm Sunjat Kai from J19. So I made a bet with Mr. Koh that if I get D or below, I will recite a speech to show my guilt. So this is gonna be that speech. History Paper 2, 2020. Results for the Fair Division SEA. Sunjat Kai, 19J19 Party, 11 pages. DJ Anesko, History Teachers Party, full of disappointment. Total questions done, 3. Total rejected questions, 1. Amount written in paper is conclusive of the results. I declare DJ Anesko, History Teachers Party, to be the member elected for the Fair Division of SEA. Sunjat Kai of 19J19 Party will now be subject to reflection and great gratitude for DJ Anesko in creating a fair and wonderful paper. I will now use Chinese to elaborate on these results. 长话短说，我们了解你的伤心。考试成绩，我们不要让这个学校变成一个学校，其他校就奖学金。可是我们这些低挂的学生一直被虐待。长话短说，许汉耀老师虐待学生，谢谢。
Hello everybody, welcome to the final content podcast of the DJ Anes series, getting you the best in Southeast Asian history from independence to the year 2000. What a journey it has been. Thank you guys for sticking through with us. Thank you for your loyal support. Thank you for all the fan mail that I've been receiving. Thank you for the gifts and the sponsorships. Thank you for all the money that's been coming in. Truly amazing experience. I totally did it for the passion and not the material goods. For any third party listening in right now, there was actually no money involved, and I did this out of pure slavery for my kids because I love them so much. So the real currency over here is love. Wow. What an opener. Give me a round of applause, everybody. Yep, this is the last content podcast. After this, we will be going into more skills-based stuff and all that. If there are podcasts that are going to be released, it will be on those kind of things. Oh, not if, but okay, when the podcasts are released, it will be more on skills and things like that. So, this is the last podcast that is to do with content. And actually, there isn't really that much new content in this podcast as well. It's more of a tie-up, it's more of a consolidation, it's more on certain frameworks and strategies to think about the AFC and how to respond to certain types of questions. So it's kind of a mix between that content and skills and argument. Once this is done, we are going to then move into more argument-based stuff, more SPQ-based stuff. There will still be podcasts that are going to be released, but I think it will just focus more on those kind of things. After today's podcast, there are some things that you need to go and read, some things that you need to go and revise with regards to this topic on AFC. So this podcast will be quite short. I think you can get by it pretty quickly. And then after that, there's some like massive reading that needs to be done. Our focus for today is really going to be on responses and consequences of the AFC. So it's later time frame kind of stuff during the crisis period, and it will be a nice complement to what we have already covered with the causes as well as the immediate responses to the AFC, which was the subject of the last podcast. So if you haven't heard any podcasts about the AFC responses, right? I think it's the last two podcasts. There was one on AFC there's one on governments, and then there's one on IMF. So if you haven't gone to listen to that yet, you have to listen to that first before you come to this podcast. I released those podcasts before the common test. Some of y'all might have just not listened to it because it wasn't relevant for the common test, but this topic, it will be relevant for the prelims and of course your A-levels, right? Yeah, don't forget we still got this thing called A-levels. Yep, so it's going to be relevant for that. We have to assume that, AFC questions are coming out, and of course responses and consequences are part of the whole package in this topic. So if you guys are ready, we'll just get straight into it. And once you're done with this, I'll direct you as to like what kind of readings you can take a look at towards the end of this podcast. So going into your syllabus document, these are the kind of things that we are going to be covering today. A lot to do with responses and consequences. Now, one of the big things that I want to emphasize as we move towards a consolidation of these themes, topics, right, is I want you all to note the interchangeability and the interlinks between causes, responses, and consequences. So these are the three big topics identified for this topic of AFC: causes, responses, consequences. And they may not be as distinct as you think them to be. So like this is really important. You got to write this down like somewhere. Make sure that you find the linkages between causes, responses, and consequences. So just to give you a precursor, like what I mentioned in the last podcast, a lot of the responses the effectiveness of you judging the responses is going to be based upon whether or not they align to the core issues that the country is facing at that point in time. And a lot of the core issues, you have to dig up causes content in order to understand what are the issues and to see, whether or not the responses are aligned to it, whether or not they're effective, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like, you see, across like subtopic kind of thing. Another way this subtopic cross can be seen is, let's say, for example, depending on the effectiveness of your responses, it might either lessen or improve the consequences phase of the crisis, or it might actually worsen some of the issues from the immediate outbreak period. So the nature of the responses would affect the type of consequences and the severity of the consequences that you see. Now, conversely, this situation can be cyclical. The type of consequences that you see could in turn also affect the degree of responses or the type of responses or the effectiveness of responses. So we must, when we looked at political stability, we talked about the elite and the mass level. When we looked at national unity, we looked at the elite and the mass level. When we looked at economic development, we look at state and non-state actors, elite and mass level as well. So here too as well in AFC, you got to adopt this framework as well, the elite and the mass. These kind of levels, they will interact with one another in the crisis period, and you can see the differentiation of nations, the type of experiences they had during the AFC. A lot of it is going to be determined by these kind of dynamics between the actors during the crisis period. Oh, and don't forget, you have the international actors as well, like the IMF, the World Bank, World Development Bank, ASEAN, these kind of things. Individual external actors as well, like the US, China, Japan, so on and so forth. So all these things you need to consider as you go into thinking about the AFC, especially in responses and consequences. There's a lot to cover. So don't make the mistake to say that AFC lesser contents here like compared to ED. No, actually when you break it down and you think about it, there's actually quite a lot to cover, and it's on the same scale as ED, just that the time span is a bit shorter. But I think the depth at which you go for AFC it can go quite deep as well. Thus far we've only dealt with causes of the AFC, so that's quite scope to that. But then now we are going to responses and consequences. When you study, you can see that actually this is quite a big topic as well. So strategize, which one you want to choose. Of course, both are viable, ED as well as AFC. So yeah, just make your choice. Now, the first thing that I want to go into has to do with governmental responses. So questions like these are going to be based upon an assessment of the importance of governments in responding, or the effectiveness of governments in responding. Remember during postmortem, I told you all that there's going to be slight differences between the question focus if it's on importance versus if it's on effectiveness versus if it's on suitability. So any one of these terms could appear for these kind of AFC responses questions as well. And we are going to be judging the state responses for their sense of importance as well as their sense of effectiveness. Sometimes the question is a two-factor question. They will give you another actor to compare the state towards to. So it could be non-state actors, it could be international actors, and so on and so forth. But you see the question, what it gives you. But over here, I thought it would be a good idea for us to look at the overview of what are the major determinants that are differentiating the case studies in their quality of responses, in the speed of their responses, in the effectiveness and alignment of their responses. So we do know that there are 5 crisis hit countries, and we by now should know that the degree of crisis, the devastation, and so on and so forth, there is a variance across the nations, and so too in the responses. I think you would know by now also that there is a variance across the nations, and we want to understand what are some of the factors accounting for this variance that we can see across the nations. So the first one I want to talk about is the political, economic culture and political will. I think you might know this point also as government cronyism, but or crony capitalism, that kind of broad phrasing. That is a phenomenon itself, but the way I phrase it here is more of a determinant because I'm looking at, again, the variance of case studies. So more of like the counterpoint to governmental cronyism or crony capitalism. I mean, the counterpoint, I think, will be looking at things like transparency. We'll be looking at things like governmental integrity. But when we think of the determinant here, what we're really looking at is the culture of the way economics is conducted in that country, its connections to the political elite, and the degree of political will in terms of making genuine change when they are faced with this crisis. So I think that when you look at the spectrum of case studies, some countries like Indonesia, Thailand, for instance, the political economic culture of elite corruption and those kind of very shady activities and all that kind of stuff, decisions made on self-interest against rational economic decision making, I think those things are a lot more entrenched within their cultures and their economic practices and cultures. So it's a lot harder to, because it's so entrenched, right? It's a lot harder to see an overnight change, or it's a lot harder to reform this entire system because it is systemic, it is structural, and on top of that, right, this goes beyond just rules and procedure. This goes into interpersonal relationships, between human actors. So it's a lot harder for that kind of stuff to reform compared to countries like Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, where with some of these countries, I do think that maybe there's some inequalities or some level of elite corruption here and there, but not to the scale of Thailand and Indonesia. And when you want to reform the system over there, it might make it a bit easier. There is an ease towards reform, or there are already international standards of compliance that are already there. So they, when they meet the crisis or when they want to refine their system, it isn't met with a lot of roadblocks. It isn't met with a lot of resistance from either state or non-state actors. On that note, we go on to the second point: responses from non-state actors. Last podcast we talked about government action, and one of the key things about effectiveness we said is action must translate into positive outcomes, right? In order for it to be considered effectiveness. Now, when action doesn't translate into significant outcomes, or when action doesn't translate into good outcomes, what are the reasons responsible for that? It might be down to the governments themselves and it's flawed, or it's just lack of political will, or whatever it is, sure. But it might be down to how willing and how committed are the non-state actors in this process as well. I am talking primarily about the banks, the finance companies. How willing are they to reform their practices? How willing are they to comply to international standards? How willing are they to adopt certain measures that will better safeguard their money flows and their loans and things like that? So sometimes the political economic culture, that sense of crony capitalism or that sense of self-interest based decision making, it extends to the non-state actors as well, the domestic non-state actors, and because of that there's a lot of resistance. So that might affect the ease of reform and how fast you can recover from the crisis. So but it goes back to fundamentals lah. I mean, if the culture has been like that all the while, then it's very difficult to remove. But if the culture has been something different, something more based on standards, something more based on rational decision making, something more based on sound governance or a working relationship with the government, that kind of stuff. If those are the long-standing culture, then when it's come time for reform or refinement of the system, it's going to be relatively easier compared to other countries which do not have this same sense of culture. Another thing about quite closely connected to political will is point number 3, but this one looks more at the it's more theory based, in the sense that you're looking more at whether the policy aligns to the core needs, or are they trying to skirt the issue? Are they trying to sidestep the issue and do some superficial change but not really addressing the core nature of it because it threatens their interests, or they don't have the means to do so, and things like that. So I think this one is more of an economic assessment rather than a political economic culture kind of assessment. So we're looking here at the different degrees of strategies and their effectiveness across the different Southeast Asian states. And because now we are looking at the entire time frame of the crisis period, we are looking at the start, the immediate responses, as well as the intermediate and the later responses. And we want to see if there's number one, I think we want to see if there's a degree of consistency. So countries like, let's say, Singapore, from the beginning to the end, there's a consistency in sound policy making. And there are some countries that maybe at the start wasn't so good, but then somewhere in the middle period or whatever, it changed and it got better. So we want to look at those kind of case studies as well. And then there are some countries where it seems to get better, but then there are some outstanding problems that were just never ever resolved. So we want to look at those kind of case studies as well. But how point 3 differs from point 1, it's point 1 we're really looking at the kind of culture in the economy, and then point 3 we're looking at the actual policies itself and making our assessments based on that. Point 4, external intervention, IMF's role in the region. So one of the determinants that can affect the type of responses and the degree of success would also come in the form of external actors. And the biggest external actor that we can see in the AFC response period is the IMF. Now, the IMF, in the last podcast, I did mention that it had a particularly problematic role, and it had quite problematic effects as well in its initial assessment of the crisis and in its initial prescriptive measures. So kind of like the misdiagnosis did translate into spillover problems, and these spillover problems were not only confined to the economic sphere, but it could spill over into the political social sphere as well. The case study is Indonesia, and we looked at how the IMF had initially, misdiagnosed the problem, or there was a misalignment between what the IMF were calling for versus what the core issues of the Indonesian economy was. So that's the economic side of things. But then later on, because of the way IMF were intervening in Indonesia's economy, there were a lot of strong associations between the IMF and Suharto. And pretty soon, Suharto became seen as this unnationalistic figure. And that prompted a lot of street riots and anti-Suharto protests that eventually removed him from power in 1998. So you can see that what can start out as an economic situation can further translate into political, social situations. But going back to this point, this kind of chain of events was seen because of intervention, and intervention can cause problems as much as it can help the situation. I put here Thailand, Indonesia versus Philippines. Philippines and the IMF had a very cooperative relationship and a very long-standing relationship, like even before the crisis. And that's largely because the Philippines and the US have a strong connection. So, I think when it came time for the IMF to help the Philippine economy in the crisis period, I think there was a greater alignment over there, the greater collaborative relationship and culture that had been established before the crisis, and therefore IMF intervention over there didn't really cause any alarm, didn't really cause any, it's just like a normal day like for them. So that kind of collaborative relationship I think was quite seen different in Thailand and maybe, Indonesia and maybe even Thailand, where IMF assistance was not really seen as collaboration, but seen as an imposition or seen as abuse. The kind of nationalist tinted images of external intervention in your economy. So this is the Thailand and Indonesia versus the Philippines. But you can versus other countries also, like Singapore and Malaysia, who didn't even have that kind of IMF intervention and that kind of IMF assistance during the AFC. Singapore and Malaysia, famously, rejected IMF intervention in that sense, because Mahathir was, quite adamant not to do that. So, did that translate into more economic and political stability for Malaysia and Singapore, which didn't even have intervention in the first place? So my point here is that this determinant, this factor of an international actor influencing or interfering or intervening in this crisis, that could affect the pace as well as the quality of the recovery period as well. Point 5, looking at the state of socio-economic damage and socio-economic upheaval. So this one requires us to look at the contextual landscape. Number one, the state of economic damage. We want to look at how badly were the countries affected in the first place at the outbreak period, because those foundations, that foundational damage and how big it was, it could have affected the chances of the remedy measures having an effect. So if the scale is so damaged and is so extensive and all that, you can propose changes, but it would likely take a period of time to have an effect, versus a country that is relatively less affected. The prescriptive measures and the remedy measures coming in, it will take a shorter time to take effect because of the lessened scale of the damage. The socio-political upheaval part is what I mentioned earlier just now, which is that sometimes we need to look at the non-economic factors and the non-economic landscape to understand the variance of recovery pace and efforts. So in places where there was social upheaval and in places where there was political change, that could have affected the continuity of reform, and in a sense you have been a distraction for the economic recovery efforts. So those kind of non-economic factors, the more they are out there, the more disruptive it is likely to be on the economic setting itself. So again, that kind of comparison across the case studies, some of them did experience it, some of them didn't experience it. What kind of effect did it have in terms of their consequences and in terms of their responses, the efforts and the effectiveness as well. So yeah, this slide basically, it's like those kind of determinants-based essay. Why were some nations more devastated than others? That kind of stuff. Or why did some nations have better responses than others? That kind of questions. We structure it through the determinants-based approach. Each of these can serve as a TS, and within the paragraphs you can have contrasting case studies based on these determinants, and then you have a fully functioning argument based on these set of things. Of course, these 5 are not exhaustive. You can include, if you find more determinants. I think there are 1 or 2 more determinants out there, but yeah, you can start with these first. The second big thing that I want to consolidate is the IMF. So the last time around I spoke quite a bit on the IMF in the podcast, and we looked at the initial responses, we looked at the misdiagnosis, and we looked at some of the problems with IMF funding and its conditions that it set. So those are all the kind of problems, but over here I kind of want to give the balanced view to the IMF, because no one really views the IMF as a organization that is going to handicap your economy. If not, they wouldn't even be going to the IMF for assistance in the first place. So over here, taking a look at some of the features of the IMF and the value that it has to helping and assisting economies in recovery. So yeah, these are some of the points that will cover that. The first one, definitely IMF financial support. I mean, that's literally in the name itself, International Monetary Fund, right? So, well, I think the point explained by itself, by its title. You need the money, right? And this money, the technical term for it in this case is called the disbursements of funds. So disbursement would come in phases. Like, they won't just like throw you the money all at once, but it will come in phases, and it would be attached with certain conditions as well. I think it's quite an easy concept to understand. You just think of like pocket money or allowance from your parents. Let's say your parents give you like monthly, I almost say salary, monthly pocket money, right? Let's say they give you like $200 a month, and then like on the 15th of that month, you realize that, holy crap, I spent all $200 already. So you go to your parents, right, and you say, hey man, I need some money, I'm broke. And then your parents will be like, man, then nag for 2 hours plus, right? And then they'll say, okay, but because I love you, I'm still going to give you money, but I'm going to give you it in phases. Now, I'm not going to give it to you monthly, I'm going to give it to you weekly, and you must follow these conditions, or you must do the chores, you must like mop the floor, and so on and so forth, in order to earn this extra money that I'm going to give you, right? I think many of us have been that kind of situations before, but not me. If I ran out of my money, my mom just threw me out of the house. JK. No, not really. That was literally once that happened. Scarred me forever. Slept outside for one whole night. Not a nice feeling. And an emotional scar that will never recover. Thanks, Mom. Going back to this set of slides. So now I think you can kind of understand funding and all that kind of stuff. The second one has to do with their legislative. In a sense, it's kind of their legislative power, coupled together maybe with their moral authority or their legal authority. I wouldn't say legal. Their kind of credibility and the authority that stems from them being the foremost international organization. You know, there's a measure of weight and clout that will come from them. So what they say has a certain measure of gravitas, and a lot of it comes through their prescriptive measures and proposals for restructuring and creating a lot of systemic reform. Remember, all these things have to be tied to the central problems, the structural problems in these crisis-hit countries in the first place. So a lot of the prescriptive things you see over here, a lot of it has to do with the sectors that are in crisis and the problems that they are facing. So a broad spread of things you can see over here. The third point over there even has to do with certain segments of the population, ensuring, in a sense, greater equity, greater safety nets for them, to take care of the certain segments of the population who might be suffering harder than others during a crisis. And the last one over there, it has something to do with political culture as well. Now, when you assess the IMF, I think with regards to the economic proposals and the things that they are suggesting for restructuring and all that, I think fairly well done actually, especially after the initial misdiagnosis when they kind of like recalibrated everything and when they begin to understand what is the source of the problem more. I think those economic remedy measures were actually like sound and aligned to the problem, right? In the Southeast Asian economies. But I think there are some things that it just cannot overcome, or at least it's very, very difficult, and success is only to a limited degree over there. I'm thinking specifically of that political economic culture of crony capitalism or elite cronyism or elite corruption or those kind of self-interest based decision making. I think no matter what kind of clout you have as an international organization, a lot of these things come down to the individual will of the national governments and the non-state actors even. So there can be certain legislative prescriptions, such as you need to conform to these international standards and you need to abide by these rules and regulations. There's going to be more regulation in your economy, in your finance sector right now. Like, they can do all those things, and I think it's sound policy making. But whether or not the effects translate is another thing. I feel that a lot of it is contingent on the domestic actors themselves. So that's a point of argument and debate over there. I leave it for you as well. And another role that the IMF plays is they serve as some form of coordination body. Remember, their prescription and their remedy measures and all that is quite comprehensive and holistic, not just targeting the sectors but trying to marshal together whatever assistance they can across different bodies to help out with the situation. So yeah, that's something that I would like to I would need you all to look at for the IMF as well, and the kind of value that they have for the organization. Sorry, my Juno is here, just wanting some attention. Got distracted for a while. Moving on. Okay, the last one that I want to talk about is consequences itself. So now, consequences itself can be tested as a question. So the question can be like what I mentioned just now, like very broad. Why were some countries more devastated than others? So that one is like a mix between consequences, responses, causes, so on. So a question that encompasses everything. But then there can be specific consequences questions. So the devastation in the AFC was felt more in the economic sector compared to the political arena. Something like that. So it could be something very focused on comparing consequences across nations or across sectors, things like that. Over here, I've structured it for you such that we are looking at the 3 identified consequences segments in your syllabus: economic, social, and political. So I think this is the most stable framework to look at consequences, seeing that it's in your syllabus document as well. So yeah, let's go through it. So economic consequences, I think, in a question that requires you to compare between these 3 things, right? Economic, political, social. Like, even if you, okay, and let's say the comparison is saying, or which of them were the most devastated. I think given that this is the AFC, right, and given that this is an economic topic, and given that we are looking at economic history and the devastation is really tied to economics, like whether or not you agree that economic is the largest consequences thing, right, I feel that there should be substantial paragraphs on this or substantial points on this, simply because, right, it is this theme and I think simply because there's a need to address the fundamentals of this crisis itself, which is economics by nature. So you have to know a sizable bit about what kind of economic consequences there are out there. And when I talk about economic consequences, I don't just want you all to look at within the nation itself. So like within the nation, you're looking at, what's happening to finance, what's happening to currency, what's happening to banking, what's happening to the export sectors, and so on and so forth. Please look at that. But you also will need to look at the devastation across the region. Looking at the scale, the widespreadness of this crisis across the region, it does give a lot of weight to this idea that economic devastation was really the most it was one of the most serious consequences. Looking at a country like Singapore, even Singapore is dragged into this entire thing, right? It does suggest that the economic consequences are really quite severe, and perhaps even more so than political and social consequences. Another way for you to kind of do a relative comparison or draw up a relationship between these three is to see, which one seems to be the foundation for the other two. So the foundational factor would usually have a greater sense of importance, even though the other two may be severe themselves. So the economic consequences as being foundational for political and social upheaval, right? Political and social upheaval definitely is very important, and it is very severe in some countries as well. However, they stem from the economic issues in the first place, thereby giving more importance to the economic issues that these social and political reactions are based upon. So you need to construct the kind of relationships if you want to evaluate the factors, their relative importance. I think about political and social damage and consequences over there. I think I do acknowledge that they are severe, but whether or not they're representative of the 5 case studies, that one has some question marks, because when we think about political change, actually there are only 2 countries, Indonesia and Thailand, where governments were forced out of power. Philippines changed president from Ramos to Estrada, but that was not by force. That was because Ramos's term was up as president, and that moved on to Estrada. And in fact, Ramos did well to manage the crisis. So with regards to political consequences in terms of change in government, honestly, you only have 2 case studies. You might want to question whether it's representative of the trend as a whole. Social upheaval, same thing, these 2 case studies. But if you want to broaden your scope of social consequences to think about other things like unemployment, cost of living, things like that, then there's more to talk about with regards to the nations, because I think all 5 of them would suffer from economic consequences like this. Even Singapore, and in fact Singapore's number one worry was unemployment, and that kind of is a social consequence as well. So thinking about those kind of things would help you to evaluate between these 3 different frameworks. So that's all actually I have for today. Now what I need you guys to do is to go to the main set of notes, right? This is the one that looks like this. I think from page 30 onwards, it really is about consequences and responses and so on. So, just read from there. That's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is go to this particular folder in your Google Drive, AFC Overview. There is a shitload of supplementary notes there that I've created on top of the main set of notes. So you read the main set of notes first, then you go into the supplementary set of notes. They are organized by the topic, so causes, consequences, responses. You can just take a look at that and do some reading there. And then finally what you can do is go to the hard copy file in J10's Pigeonhole, and you can take a look at the AFC questions over there, classified by the topics as well. But I really do want you all to read the responses and consequences essays, so as to borrow points, or you can borrow evidence. Because now's the time to work smart and just do these kind of things. Last year the kids did the same, the year before, and so on and so forth. Every year we do the same thing. Now's the time to study efficiently and smartly, and I think this is one of the ways we can build our knowledge based upon what our seniors have left us. You yourself will leave for your juniors as well, so it's a whole cycle, and Ohana means family. DJ Anesh out.
Yeah, man. I think the argument sequencing is not bad, but then there seems to be a problem with the explanations. Maybe not detailed enough. I never really used the indicators, especially in the last part of the paragraph. I think I better make a note of this. Also, I think the evidence can increase a bit.
Mille paps, jou, 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 jou. Mille paps, ach как вкусно, ням-ням-ням. Mille paps, jou, 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 jou. Mille paps, jou, 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 jou. Mille paps, ach как вкусно, ням-ням-ням.